The thermometer nailed to Henrik Larsen's cabin wall read 42 degrees, and outside the January blizzard was killing everything it touched. He sat near his fireplace, wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to wind that sounded like screaming, and he knew that 3 miles away, Samuel Dennison's family was freezing to death in a cabin identical to the one Henrik's brother had died in the year before. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1842 arrived in Montana Territory with unusual violence. Henrik Larsen and his younger brother Thomas had built their cabin the previous summer on a creek tributary about 15 miles south of what would eventually become Helena. The cabin was typical of the era. Horizontal log construction with saddle-notch corners, mud and moss chinking between the gaps, a single room measuring roughly 16 feet by 14 feet, one door, one small window covered with oiled paper, and a simple stone and mud fireplace in the corner. 2 men working steadily could build such a structure in 5 to 7 days. It provided shelter from wind and rain. For most purposes, that was sufficient. Thomas was 23 years old, 4 years younger than Henrik. They had emigrated from Norway 3 years earlier, worked briefly in lumber camps near the Great Lakes, then headed west when they heard about opportunities in the fur trade. The Rocky Mountain beaver trade was past its peak by 1842, but men could still make decent money if they were willing to work hard and live in isolation. The Larsen brothers were both willing. They had established their trap lines, built their cabin, and prepared for winter with what they believed was adequate supplies and shelter. The blizzard hit on January 9th. Temperature had been cold, but manageable for the previous week, dropping to around 10 degrees at night, rising to the low 20s during the day. Then the weather changed. A massive storm system moved down from Canada, bringing wind that gusted to 40 and 50 miles per hour and temperatures that plummeted to 20 below zero. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The Larsen brothers were inside their cabin when the storm arrived in the early afternoon. They had firewood stacked inside and enough food for 2 weeks. They believed they would be fine. By evening, they realized something was wrong. Despite keeping a large fire burning constantly in the fireplace, the cabin was brutally cold. They could see their breath inside. The fire heated the air immediately around it, but that warmth seemed to vanish almost instantly. The walls, chinked as well as they could manage, allowed cold air to seep through dozens of small gaps. The oiled paper window provided almost no insulation. The door, made from split logs, had gaps around its edges where wind whistled through. But the biggest problem was one they didn't understand at the time. Heat rises. The warmth from their fire was going straight up and out through the roof and chimney. The cold air was coming in low, through every crack and gap in the walls. They were sitting in the coldest part of the cabin, while all their heat escaped above them. Thomas started showing signs of hypothermia around midnight. He was shivering uncontrollably despite being wrapped in both their blankets and sitting as close to the fire as he could without burning himself. Henrik kept the fire roaring, burning through their carefully rationed firewood at an alarming rate. Nothing helped. The cabin simply would not hold heat. By 3 in the morning, Thomas had stopped shivering. That was a bad sign. It meant his body was shutting down. Henrik tried to keep him awake, tried to keep him moving, but Thomas was too weak. He died just before dawn, while the blizzard still raged outside. Henrik buried Thomas on a hillside overlooking the creek when the storm finally cleared 3 days later. The ground was frozen, so he covered the body with stones and marked the spot with a wooden cross he carved from a split log. He spent that night back in the cabin that had killed his brother, unable to sleep, staring at the fireplace and trying to understand what had gone wrong. Spring came in late March of 1843. Henrik had survived the rest of the winter, but barely. He had burned through nearly all his firewood, keeping the cabin marginally habitable. He had lost weight. He had come close to freezing several more times during particularly cold nights. But he had survived, and survival had given him time to think about a problem that now consumed him completely. Heat rises. Henrik knew this from basic observation. Smoke rises. Steam rises. Warm air goes up. He started paying obsessive attention to how heat moved inside his cabin. He would build a fire and then move around the small space, noting temperature differences. Near the floor, even with the fire burning hot, the air was cold. At chest height, it was slightly warmer. Near the ceiling, up where the roof logs met the walls, the air was noticeably warmer. He could feel it when he stood on his sleeping platform. All the heat his fire produced was going straight up to the ceiling and then escaping through the roof and chimney. He was heating the sky while he froze at ground level. He began visiting other trappers' camps within riding distance. He would ask to see their cabins, and he would study how they were built. Every single cabin he examined had the same fundamental flaw: single-story construction with the living space directly under the roof. Heat rose from the fire, collected briefly at the ceiling, and then escaped. The roof itself, made from poles and bark or split shakes, provided minimal insulation. Cold air from outside easily penetrated down, while warm air from inside easily escaped up. It was, Henrik realized, the worst possible design for retaining heat. Most trappers accepted this as simply how cabins worked. You built a fire, it provided some heat, you endured the cold, and you survived, or you didn't. Henrik couldn't accept that. His brother had died because their cabin couldn't hold heat. That death could have been prevented with better design. He started developing a theory. What if the heat could be trapped before it escaped? What if there was a space above the living area that could capture and hold the rising warm air? What if that trapped heat could act as a barrier between the living space and the cold outside? The concept seemed sound in principle. Warm air rises and collects at the highest point. If you created a second level, a loft or upper story, that warm air would fill that space and stay there, creating an insulating layer. When Henrik mentioned this idea to William Cartwright, an English trapper who stopped by in early April, the response was immediate mockery. William Cartwright laughed when Henrik explained his concept. They were standing outside Henrik's cabin on a mild April morning, and Henrik had just described his plan to build a two-story structure with a functional loft designed specifically to trap rising heat. "You're planning to build 2 floors?" Cartwright said. "Out here? For what purpose? So you can have a parlor and a drawing room like some gentleman in St. Louis?" Henrik tried to explain the thermal principle. Warm air rises and escapes through a single-story roof. A second level would capture that warm air before it escaped, creating an insulating buffer between the living space and the exterior cold. The loft wouldn't be a full second story, just a half story built into the roof structure, but it would be high enough to trap significant heat. Cartwright shook his head. "That's double the logs, double the work, double the time. A man can build a perfectly good cabin in a week. You're talking about spending all summer building something that does the same job." "It doesn't do the same job," Henrik said. "That's the point. A standard cabin loses all its heat. This design would hold it." "Your cabin kept you alive all winter," Cartwright pointed out. "Barely," Henrik said, "and it killed Thomas." Cartwright's expression softened slightly, but his opinion didn't change. "I'm sorry about your brother, truly. But he died because the cold was brutal and because hypothermia happens, not because the cabin was wrong. Every trapper out here lives in the same kind of cabin. We all survive." "Not all of us," Henrik said quietly. Word of Henrik's plan spread through the scattered trapping community over the following weeks. Most reactions ranged from skepticism to outright ridicule. Jakob Müller, a German trapper who had been in the territory for 6 years, stopped by in early May. He listened to Henrik's explanation with more patience than Cartwright had shown. "I understand the idea," Müller said. Heat rises, you trap it, you stay warmer. But Henrik, the work involved. You're talking about a summer's worth of construction. Yes, Henrik agreed. For a cabin you might only use 2 or 3 winters before moving on to new trapping territory. I'm not moving on, Henrik said. I'm staying here, and I'm building something that will keep me alive. Muller nodded slowly. Then I wish you luck. But I think you'll find most men won't follow this path. It's too much effort for uncertain gain. Henrik had already accepted that he would build alone and without support. He spent late May and all of June cutting logs. He needed more timber than a standard cabin required, and he was selective about what he cut. He wanted straight logs of uniform diameter, approximately 12 inches thick. He rejected anything with significant taper or irregular shape. He stripped each log completely, removing all bark. The work was exhausting and monotonous, but by early July he had 60 logs ready for construction. Henrik began construction in mid-July of 1843. He selected a site 200 yards from his old cabin on slightly higher ground with good drainage and clear sight lines in all directions. The first step was creating an elevated foundation, something most trappers never bothered with. He cut 8 short logs, each about 3 feet long, and set them vertically into shallow holes arranged in a rectangular pattern. These would serve as piers, lifting the cabin floor above ground level to prevent moisture damage and allow air circulation underneath. On top of these piers, he laid horizontal sill logs that would support the floor joists. The elevation was only about 18 inches, but it required building a small set of steps for the entrance. Most trappers would consider this wasted effort. Henrik understood it was essential for long-term durability and thermal efficiency. Cold transferred through direct ground contact. Airspace beneath the floor would reduce that transfer. The first floor walls went up using standard horizontal log construction. Henrik used saddle notch corners because they were reliable, and he knew how to build them properly. Each log was fitted carefully, and he used a clay-based chinking mixture between them, packing it tight to eliminate gaps. The first floor walls rose to 7.5 feet, creating a living space tall enough to stand comfortably, with room for heat to rise toward the ceiling. The innovative part began when he started the second level. Instead of stopping at one story and adding a roof directly to the top wall logs, Henrik continued building upward. He created a half-story loft with walls that rose another 4 feet before transitioning into the roof structure. This loft would be the heat-trapping zone. The space wasn't tall enough for a full second story, but it provided approximately 4 feet of vertical space under the roof peak, enough for a sleeping platform, and enough volume to capture significant warm air. The transition from first-floor walls to loft walls to roof was the critical architectural element. Henrik created 2 distinct eave lines. The first eave was where the main roof structure began its pitch, right at the top of the first-floor walls. The second eave was where the loft walls met the upper roof section. This double-eave system meant the roof had 2 separate starting points at different heights, creating a layered thermal barrier. For the gable ends, Henrik switched from horizontal logs to vertical plank siding. This was lighter weight and easier to fit into the triangular roof shape. He cut small window openings in the upper gable, rectangular openings about 20 inches square. These would provide ventilation for the loft and allow him to control airflow without losing excessive heat. The roof itself was steep-pitched, approximately 45 degrees. This angle would shed snow effectively and maximize the interior volume of the loft space. Henrik used split shakes over a layer of bark, creating a reasonably waterproof covering. The exterior structure was complete by late September, but Henrik spent another 3 weeks on interior work that would make the thermal system function properly. The fireplace was critical. He built it in the corner of the first floor using flat stones he gathered from a nearby creek bed. The fireplace was larger than typical frontier construction, with a firebox deep enough to hold substantial logs and a throat designed to create strong draft while minimizing heat loss up the chimney. Henrik positioned the fireplace strategically so its heat would radiate into the center of the first-floor living space. He built a stone hearth that extended 3 feet into the room, creating thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. The chimney was constructed with a slight inward angle, creating a smoke shelf that would reflect heat back into the room rather than letting it escape directly upward. The first floor became his primary living area. He built a work table, storage shelves, and a food preparation area. This was where he would spend his waking hours during winter, where he would cook, eat, maintain his equipment, and process furs. The space was functional and compact, roughly 14 feet by 16 feet of usable area. The connection between first floor and loft was a simple ladder built into the wall near the fireplace. The opening to the loft was not a full staircase, but rather a hatch approximately 3 feet square. This small opening was intentional. Henrik wanted warm air to rise into the loft, but he wanted to control how much and how quickly. A large open stairway would allow too much heat to escape too rapidly. The small hatch would create a natural restriction, slowing the air movement and allowing heat to accumulate in the loft gradually. The loft itself was simple. Henrik built a sleeping platform along one wall using split planks. The platform was raised about 8 inches off the loft floor, providing storage space underneath for furs, extra supplies, and equipment. The loft ceiling followed the roof line, creating a peaked space that was 4 feet tall at the center and sloping down to perhaps 2 feet at the edges where the roof met the walls. The small windows Henrik had cut into the upper gable were the key to controlling the thermal system. During extreme cold, he could close these windows completely with fitted wooden shutters, trapping all warm air inside the loft. During milder weather, or when he needed ventilation, he could open one or both windows slightly, allowing moisture to escape while still retaining most of the heat. The windows were small enough that even fully open, they wouldn't dump all the warm air out rapidly. Henrik tested the system during the first cold snap in early October. Outside temperature dropped to 30 degrees overnight. He built a moderate fire in the fireplace before sunset and maintained it through the evening. By midnight, the first floor was comfortable, around 55 degrees. He climbed into the loft and immediately felt the difference. The loft was noticeably warmer, perhaps 65 degrees. The warm air from below had risen through the hatch and collected in the upper space, exactly as he had theorized. Winter arrived in early November, and with it came the trappers who had heard about Henrik's unusual construction project. William Cartwright was the first to visit, riding up on a cold afternoon when the first significant snow was falling. He dismounted, studied the cabin from outside, and shook his head with visible disapproval. "Larson's castle, castle," he said. "That's what they're calling it at Fisk's trading post." "You spent the entire summer building this?" 12 weeks, Henrik confirmed. Cartwright walked around the structure, examining the elevated foundation, the 2-story profile, the small loft windows in the upper gable. "I built my cabin in 6 days. It keeps me just as warm as this monstrosity will keep you." Henrik didn't argue. He had learned that explaining the thermal principles to skeptics was pointless. They would understand or they wouldn't. Words wouldn't convince them. "You'll be hauling twice the firewood to heat twice the space," Cartwright continued. "And for what? So you can sleep upstairs like some fancy gentleman? This is foolishness, Henrik. Expensive, time-consuming foolishness." Jakob Müller visited a week later, more diplomatic but equally doubtful. He accepted Henrik's invitation to come inside and see the layout. Henrik showed him the first-floor living area, then climbed the ladder to the loft and invited Müller to follow. The German trapper climbed up, looked around the small sleeping space, and nodded thoughtfully. "It's well built," Müller admitted. "I can see you put care into the work. But Henrik, this is a lot of cabin for one man, and the heating costs will be less than a standard cabin," Henrik interrupted. "Not more." Müller looked skeptical. How do you figure that? The heat stays inside instead of escaping. I'll burn less wood, not more. We'll see, Mueller said. I hope you're right. I truly do. But I think you've built yourself a beautiful prison that will eat firewood and leave you cold anyway. The mockery wasn't malicious, but it was persistent. Other trappers who passed through the area that early winter made comments. Some called it the Fool's Tower. Others referred to it as Henrik's Hotel. The implication was always the same. Henrik had wasted an entire building season creating something unnecessarily complex and ultimately no better than a standard cabin built in a fraction of the time. Henrik ignored the comments and focused on documenting what he was observing. He had acquired a mercury thermometer from Fisk's trading post in late October, trading 2 prime beaver pelts for it. The thermometer became his most valuable tool. He nailed it to the first-floor wall near his work table and checked it regularly. He also hung a second thermometer in the loft, suspended from a roof beam. The temperature readings told a clear story. On a night when the outside temperature dropped to 15 degrees, Henrik would build a moderate fire in the evening. By bedtime, the first-floor thermometer would read around 60 degrees. The loft thermometer would read 70 to 75 degrees. The difference was consistent and significant. The loft was capturing and holding the rising warm air exactly as Henrik had predicted. The storm that would validate Henrik's design arrived on January 14, 1844. Weather had been cold, but manageable for most of the early winter, with temperatures ranging from 0 to 20 degrees. Then, a massive Arctic front descended from Canada, bringing winds that gusted over 50 miles per hour and temperatures that dropped to 25 below zero. Snow fell so thick that trappers within 5 miles of each other might as well have been separated by 100. Samuel Dennison lived 3 miles northwest of Henrik's cabin with his wife Catherine and their 2 young children. Dennison was a Scottish trapper who had been in the territory for 4 years. His cabin was standard construction, built the previous summer. Single-story, horizontal logs with notched corners, mud chinking, one room approximately 15 feet square, a simple mud and stone fireplace. It was identical to dozens of other cabins scattered throughout Montana Territory. It was also identical to the cabin where Thomas Larson had frozen to death 2 years earlier. When the storm hit on the afternoon of January 14th, both families took the same initial actions. They moved inside, secured their doors, and built up their fires. But from that point forward, their experiences diverged dramatically. Henrik's cabin responded to the extreme cold exactly as he had designed it to respond. He built a good fire in his stone fireplace around 4 in the afternoon as the storm intensified. The fire heated the first-floor living space efficiently. Warm air rose naturally through the small hatch opening into the loft above. By evening, with the fire maintained at a steady level, the first floor held at 65 degrees according to his thermometer. The loft, where Henrik slept, was 72 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 20 below zero and still dropping. The difference between interior and exterior was 92 degrees. Henrik could hear the wind screaming outside, could hear snow pelting against the walls and roof, but inside his 2-story cabin, the temperature remained stable. He burned firewood at a moderate rate, no more than he would use during any cold night. The loft trapped the rising heat. The double-eave roof system created a thermal barrier. The elevated foundation prevented cold transfer from the frozen ground. Every design element worked together to retain warmth. 3 miles away, the Dennison family was fighting for survival. Samuel had built the largest fire his fireplace could safely hold. He was burning wood as fast as he could feed it into the flames. Despite this, the cabin temperature was dropping steadily. Cold air seeped through gaps in the chinking. The single-story design meant all the heat from the fire rose directly to the ceiling and escaped through the roof. The family huddled as close to the fireplace as possible, wrapped in every blanket they owned. By midnight, Catherine Dennison was shivering uncontrollably despite being covered with 3 blankets. The children were pressed against her, sharing body heat. Samuel kept the fire roaring, but it made almost no difference. The storm broke on the morning of January 16th after 36 hours of continuous wind and snow. Henrik woke in his loft to stillness and pale sunlight filtering through the small windows. The loft thermometer read 68 degrees. His fire had burned down to coals during the night, but the trapped heat in the loft had kept the space comfortably warm, even without active heating. He descended the ladder, rebuilt the fire, and prepared coffee. Around mid-morning, he heard someone shouting outside. He opened his door to find Samuel Dennison standing in waist-deep snow about 20 yards from the cabin. Dennison looked exhausted, his face wind-burned and haggard. He had snowshoed the 3 miles from his cabin. "We nearly died," Dennison said without preamble. "Catherine and the children. We nearly froze with a fire going all night." Henrik invited him inside. Dennison entered, stamping snow from his boots, and stopped immediately when the warmth hit him. He looked around the first-floor space, then at the thermometer on the wall. It read 62 degrees. The fire in the fireplace was moderate, nothing exceptional. "How is it this warm in here?" Dennison asked. "My cabin never got above 40 degrees the entire storm. We burned everything we could reach. I went through 4 days' worth of firewood in one night, and we still couldn't get warm." Henrik explained the design. The 2-story structure, the loft that trapped rising heat, the double-eave system creating a thermal barrier, the small hatch opening that allowed heat to rise gradually rather than escape rapidly. Dennison listened, his expression moving from confusion to understanding to something like anger. "You're telling me you stayed warm during that storm? Comfortable?" "Yes, Henrik said. "While my wife and children were shaking so hard they couldn't sleep? While I burned through half my winter wood supply in 36 hours? "I didn't know you were in trouble," Henrik said quietly. "If I had known, I would have come for you." Dennison's anger faded. He sat down heavily on Henrik's bench. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry that I didn't listen when you were building this. Cartwright told me you were wasting your time building 2 stories. Muller said you were obsessed. I thought the same thing. Now my family almost died because I built the same cabin everyone builds." "You survived," Henrik said. "Barely. Catherine is still sick from the cold. The children have frostbite on their fingers. If that storm had lasted another day—" He stopped, shook his head. "I need to see this loft. I need to understand how this works." Henrik led him up the ladder. The loft was still noticeably warmer than the first floor. Dennison stood in the small space, feeling the temperature difference. Looking at the thermometer Henrik had hung from a roof beam, 70 degrees. The fire below was moderate. The outside temperature was still below 0. The math was undeniable. "The heat rises and stays here," Dennison said slowly. "It can't escape because the roof is above this space, so it just accumulates." "Yes," Henrik confirmed, "and this warm air above keeps the living space below warmer because you're not living directly under a cold roof," Henrik finished. Samuel Dennison began building his 2-story cabin in March of 1844. Henrik helped him lay out the foundation and explained the key principles: the elevated base, the loft height needed for adequate heat collection, the small hatch opening for controlled airflow, the placement of loft windows for ventilation management. Dennison followed the design closely, making only minor modifications based on his available materials. His construction took 9 weeks. By early June, he had a cabin nearly identical to Henrik's in its thermal architecture. The following winter, Dennison reported his results to anyone who would listen. His family stayed warm throughout the cold months. His firewood consumption was half what it had been in his old single-story cabin. During a severe cold snap in February of 1845, when outside temperatures dropped to 15 below 0, his first-floor living space remained at 65 degrees with only a moderate fire. His wife and children slept comfortably in the loft, where temperatures held at 70 degrees or higher. Jacob Muller was the next convert. He visited Dennison's cabin in spring of 1845, saw the design, felt the results, and decided to rebuild. Muller's version included a full second story rather than just a loft, creating even more heat-trapping volume above the living space. His construction took 12 weeks, but the results were equally effective. The principle remained the same regardless of specific dimensions. Trap the rising heat before it escapes. Create a thermal buffer between living space and exterior cold. William Cartwright remained skeptical through 1845 and into 1846. He continued using his single-story cabin, continued burning excessive firewood to maintain barely adequate temperatures, and continued insisting that the extra work required for two-story construction wasn't justified. Then, in January of 1847, he spent 3 days visiting Mueller during a cold spell. He experienced firsthand the temperature difference between Muller's two-story cabin and his own single-story structure. When he returned home to his own cold cabin after those 3 days of comfort, something changed. He began planning his rebuild. By 1848, 7 trappers within a 20-mile radius of Henrik's original cabin had adopted some variation of the two-story design. The specific details varied. Some built full second stories. Others followed Henrik's half-story loft approach. Some used different window configurations or chimney placements. But every version incorporated the fundamental principle. Build upward. Create space above the living area to trap rising heat. Use that trapped heat as insulation against exterior cold. The technique acquired different names depending on who was describing it. Some called it Larsen-style construction, after Henrik. Others referred to it as Double-Eave building because of the distinctive two-level roof line. A few simply called it the warm cabin method. The terminology varied, but the physics didn't. Warm air rises. If you give it space to collect above your living area rather than escaping directly through your roof, that accumulated warmth creates a dramatic temperature advantage. Temperature measurements, when trappers bothered to document them, consistently showed differences of 30 to 35 degrees between interior and exterior during cold weather. A well-built two-story cabin could maintain 65 to 70 degrees inside when outside temperatures were at 0 or below. Henrik Larsen left Montana Territory in the spring of 1862. The fur trade had collapsed years earlier as beaver populations declined and silk replaced felt in hat manufacturing. Most trappers had already moved on, heading to California goldfields, Oregon farmland, or back to eastern settlements. Henrik was among the last to leave. He sold his trap lines and equipment to a homesteader family newly arrived from Pennsylvania, but he left his cabin empty. The structure was too remote and too specific to his needs for easy sale. He traveled to Oregon Territory and purchased a small farm in the Willamette Valley. He married in 1864 a widow named Anna Peterson, who had come west with a wagon train. They had 3 children. Henrik farmed wheat and raised cattle. He never spoke much about his trapping years. When neighbors asked about his past, he would say he had lived in the mountains for a time, and then changed the subject. He died in October of 1879 at the age of 64, buried in a churchyard outside Salem. His gravestone listed him as a farmer. Nothing on it mentioned cabins or thermal engineering or the innovation he had created from grief and necessity. But in Montana, the cabins remained. Homesteaders arriving under the Homestead Act discovered abandoned 2-story structures scattered through the mountain valleys. They recognized immediately that these buildings were different from typical frontier construction. Warmer in winter, more efficient with firewood, better designed for survival in harsh conditions. Many of these structures were occupied and maintained by new inhabitants, who appreciated quality craftsmanship even when they didn't know the builder's name. Margaret Holloway, a widow from Ohio, claimed Henrik's original cabin in 1868. She lived there for 11 years, supporting herself by taking in sewing work from nearby mining camps. In a letter to her sister written in January of 1872, she described the cabin as ingeniously designed with a sleeping loft that captures warmth most remarkably. I use half the firewood my neighbors require and stay twice as comfortable. Some trapper with considerable intelligence built this place. Into the 1870s and 80s, homesteaders continued building variations of the two-story design when they constructed permanent dwellings. The specific name, Larsen style, faded from use as Henrik's identity became separated from his innovation. But the principle persisted because it worked. Settlers who experienced a Montana winter in a single-story cabin and then built a two-story structure understood the difference immediately. The physics didn't care who received credit. The story of Henrik Larsen illustrates how frontier innovation often emerged not from formal education or engineering training, but from desperate necessity combined with careful observation. Henrik wasn't an architect or a scientist. He was a trapper who watched his brother freeze to death and refused to accept that outcome as inevitable. He studied how heat moved, developed a theory about trapping it, and invested an entire summer testing that theory through construction. The mockery he endured was typical of frontier reactions to unconventional approaches. Communities that valued speed and simplicity naturally viewed elaborate construction as wasteful. Only crisis, the proving storm that nearly killed the Dennison family, demonstrated that Henrik's waste was actually sophisticated engineering. Even then, adoption was gradual. Some trappers converted immediately. Others remained skeptical for years. A few never accepted the approach despite clear evidence of its effectiveness.